Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping straight into Singapore's recent general election, the one in 2025. And the big story, well, it's a pretty significant win for the People's Action Party.
Absolutely, a very strong showing. They ended up securing 87 out of the 97 seats in Parliament.
87 out of 97. That's substantial. And what really caught my eye was the national vote share. It actually increased, didn't it?
It did, yeah, up to 65.57%. That's definitely a noticeable bump from the results back in GE 2020.
And this wasn't just any election, right? This was Prime Minister Lawrence Wong's first time leading the party into one.
That's a crucial point, his first electoral test as prime minister. So yeah, the stakes were pretty high.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We've got a landslide seat-wise, an increased vote share, all during the new PM's first outing. What are people saying this signals?
Well, the general consensus among analysts seems to be that this is a strong mandate for the new government.
A strong mandate.
Yeah, if you look at reports, like Forbes had a piece highlighting how this reinforces Singapore's image globally, like as a stable hub, especially for wealth and investment. It reads as a pretty clear endorsement from the voters.
Right, a reaffirmation of that stability factor. So diving deeper, what were the key things driving this? What was on voters' minds, do we think?
It really seems like a desire for stability, especially with everything going on globally. That seems to be a major factor.
Global uncertainty.
Exactly. Analysts are suggesting voters put a lot of trust in the PAP's ability to sort of navigate these choppy waters.
Makes sense. I mean, you look around, there's a lot happening that could potentially affect Singapore.
For sure. And sources like Race Media, they specifically mentioned anxieties around the cost of living. That's a big one. And also geopolitical instability.
Okay. Cost of living, global tensions.
Yeah. And in times like these, people often lean towards the familiar, the perceived safe option.
So maybe a case of better the devil you know.
There might be an element of that, yeah. The Straits Times also brought up the PAP's track record over the last 5 years.
Including the pandemic handling.
Including how they managed the COVID-19 crisis, yes.
Mm.
That long history in power, that familiarity, it probably contributed to this feeling, this sort of flight to safety, as some put it.
Interesting. Now, CNA mentioned something about the PPAB's campaign tactics, warning about losing ministers, both current and maybe future ones.
Yes, they highlighted that strategy, the idea of potentially losing experienced leadership that could tap into concerns about effective governance, about disruption.
So reinforcing the idea that the PP is the reliable choice to keep things running smoothly.
It certainly seems like that message landed with quite a few voters. It plays into that stability narrative.
But then you see other perspectives, too. I noticed some chatter, particularly on places like Reddit, suggesting something simpler.
Oh, what was that?
Just that, maybe a lot of Singaporeans feel things are actually going pretty well for them personally. So they just didn't see a strong reason to rock the boat and vote for the opposition.
That's definitely another angle. If people feel generally secure and satisfied with the direction of the country, the motivation for drastic change is naturally lower.
Okay, so tying this back to the increased vote share compared to 2020, is it fair to say this gives the government a stronger mandate now?
That's certainly how it's being interpreted, yes. The combination of more votes and the overwhelming seat count.
Yeah.
It gives the PAP a pretty clear runway, politically speaking.
Suggests broad agreement with their direction.
At least among the majority who voted for them, yes. It suggests a level of comfort with their policies and leadership, giving them more political capital, perhaps, for the term ahead.
So this outcome really seems to underscore that trust voters placed in the PAP specifically to handle these uncertain times, the economy, Singapore's global standing.
Precisely. It looks like, for many voters, the PAP's record and their promises offered the most, let's say, reassuring path forward, given all the challenges, both at home and internationally, a significant vote of confidence.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit and talk about the opposition. How did they fare in this election? Let's start with the Workers' Party.
Right, the WP. Well, they managed to hold on to their existing seats, so they remain the only opposition party with elected MPs in Parliament.
Okay, so they defended their ground.
They did. And interestingly, CNA noted they actually secured over 40% of the vote in all the new constituencies they contested, which is, not insignificant.
40% is a decent showing in new territory.
It is. And it wasn't just the WP Chee Soon Wan from the SDP also crossed that 40% mark in Singaporean SMC.
Ah, okay. But what's the overall take on the WP's performance? Positive?
Well, analysts seem a bit divided. Some see holding their ground and making those inroads as positives, but others feel maybe the progress is too slow, not enough gains overall.
And I saw some comments, I think, on Reddit again, suggesting their strategy was maybe quite defensive this time, more about consolidating.
That was a perception, yes, focusing on protecting what they had,
Yeah.
rather than perhaps a more aggressive expansion.
All right, now what about the Progress Singapore Party, the PSP? The narrative seems quite different there.
Yeah, CNA described their outcome as a serious loss. It's pretty direct language.
A serious loss. Why? What happened?
Well, their vote share took a significant hit, particularly in the West Coast Strong West GRC.
Mm.
It dropped from about 48.3% in 2020 down to just under 40% this time.
Ouch, that's a big drop.
It is. And crucially, they lost the 2 non-constituency MP seats they held previously. So no PSP representation in Parliament now.
So what went wrong for them? What are the analysts saying?
The Straits Times suggested the PSP really needs to rethink its approach,
Yeah.
maybe move beyond relying so heavily on its founder, Tan Cheng Bok, and also reevaluate how resonant their policy proposals actually are.
Policy proposals? What kind of policies are we talking about?
Well, the Straits Times listed quite a few that were seen as perhaps quite radical, maybe even fiscally questionable by some voters.
Such as?
Things like reversing the GST hike completely, implementing a universal minimum wage, big changes to housing costs, nationalizing MediShield Life and CareShield Life.
Okay, those sound like major shifts.
They are. Also statutory retrenchment benefits, a levy on employment pass holders, increasing annual leave. Quite a comprehensive list of fairly significant policy changes.
And the concern was what? That these were maybe unsustainable.
That was part of it, yeah. Concerns about fiscal sustainability and maybe whether these proposals, while perhaps appealing in the short term, would actually be helpful for Singapore in the longer run. The perception, as the Straits Times put it, was that some of these policies might have fallen flat with the electorate.
Right. And wasn't there also something about leadership turnover within the PSP?
Yes, the frequent changes in the Secretary General position were also mentioned. That kind of instability at the top probably doesn't help project an image of a cohesive, ready-to-govern party.
Okay, so WP held on, PSP struggled. What about the other smaller parties, sometimes called the mosquito parties?
Generally, not a great election for them. Reports, especially drawing from online discussions like on Reddit, mention significant numbers of lost deposits.
Lost deposits, meaning they didn't get enough votes.
Exactly. Didn't meet the minimum threshold. And the sentiment seemed to be that voters are perhaps growing tired of parties that, only really show up around election time and maybe lack concrete, well-thought-out plans.
Any specific examples?
Well, one Reddit comment pointed to the National Solidarity Party, the NSP, getting extremely low vote shares, like between 0% and 2% in some areas.
Yeah.
The feeling was a lack of visibility between elections, and maybe a vague manifesto contributed to that.
So a sense of voter fatigue with some of these smaller players.
It seems that way. There's even a blunt comment suggesting people kind of hate PSP and the mosquitoes, which probably reflects a frustration among some voters.
Okay, so let's broaden out again. What other factors might have swayed voters this time? We mentioned stability, the economy. What about leadership? PM Wong specifically.
That's interesting because historically, new prime ministers sometimes see a dip in the party's vote share in their first election.
Oh, really?
Yeah, but PM Wong actually bucked that trend.
Yeah.
The PAP's vote share went up. So CNA highlighted this as quite notable.
So his leadership, or perhaps the transition itself, was seen positively or at least not negatively.
It appears so. It also ties back into that desire for stability we talked about. CNA's analysis suggested voters seem to opt for continuity under the established party, rather than perhaps pushing harder for more checks and scrutiny via the opposition.
And the economy. That was clearly a dominant theme.
Absolutely dominant.
Mhm.
Rice Media suggested that while people are anxious about cost of living and jobs, they might be attributing these pressures more to external global conditions rather than blaming the incumbent government directly, which, tends to benefit the party in power.
Right, if it's seen as a global problem, not a domestic failing. What about younger voters? We know from 2020 analysis they were quite engaged. Any sense of their influence this time?
It's harder to say definitively without specific post-election breakdowns for 2025 yet, but drawing parallels from 2020, younger voters often express a desire for more diverse voices, more robust debate.
And maybe less tolerance for certain tactics.
Possibly. The 2020 analysis suggested potential disapproval of what some perceive as hardline tactics. And of course, social media remains a key source of information and discussion for them.
There's also a Reddit theory I saw suggesting maybe Gen Z, being perhaps more financially literate or cautious, might have been swayed away from opposition policies seen as fiscally unsound.
That's an interesting hypothesis. It flips the script a bit, suggesting fiscal conservatism among some younger voters.
Yeah.
It's speculative, but possible.
One thing that seemed clear, though, was the difference between online chatter and the final result.
Oh, definitely. That observation came up frequently in post-election discussions, especially on Reddit itself. The general sentiment online, which often seemed more critical of the government or supportive of the opposition, didn't really translate into the overall vote share.
A disconnect, then.
A potential disconnect, yeah. It suggests that online platforms, while important spaces for discussion, might not always accurately reflect the mood or intentions of the broader electorate, the silent majority, perhaps.
There was also that slightly more cynical take on Reddit, mentioning the idea of the protective amulet of the family fading, but perhaps rhetoric around crisis and stability still works wonders.
Yes, that perspective was voiced. The idea that in times of perceived crisis or uncertainty, the appeal to established leadership and stability becomes more potent again, regardless of longer-term narratives about political dynasties.
This brings us to the whole debate around checks and balances, doesn't it? How important is that idea to the average voter?
It's clearly something people discuss, but maybe prioritize differently. Some online comments suggested a view that adding more checks and balances just adds, chaos to a system that's basically working.
So if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Kind of. But then you have the strong counter-argument, also seen online, that checks and balances are absolutely essential for long-term health and sustainability, that relying purely on the ruling party always doing the right thing is relying on luck, essentially.
It's a fundamental tension in governance, I suppose.
It is. And another perspective offered was that maybe many Singaporeans primarily want a government that delivers results and basically doesn't interfere too much in their daily lives. And the abstract idea of checks and balances might seem less critical than tangible stability and efficiency.
Interesting. Before we wrap up, there was some polling data from YouGov just before the election, right? About voter certainty.
Yes, from April 2025. It showed that quite a significant chunk, 44% of eligible voters, so they had already decided who to vote for before the election was even officially called.
44% already decided.
Wow.
Yeah.
And there were demographic differences.
Yeah.
Baby boomers showed the highest certainty. 51% of them had already made up their minds.
And who was least certain?
Gen Z. They were the most likely to say they might still change their minds, about 25% of them. And men were slightly more certain in their choice than women, according to that poll.
Fascinating how many people decide early. So bringing this all together, what are the main takeaways from this deep dive into the GE 2025 results?
Well, I think the clearest takeaway is the PAP's landslide win, fueled by that increased vote share. It strongly signals voter trust in their ability to provide stability, especially when people are worried about the economy and global instability.
A mandate built on perceived reliability in uncertain times.
Pretty much. Then you have the opposition story. The WP held its ground, remaining the sole parliamentary opposition, but other parties, particularly the PSP, really struggled. It raises questions about their strategies, their branding, and whether their policy ideas are connecting with enough voters.
And the disconnect between online sentiment and the ground reality.
That's a big one, too. It's a reminder that online discussions don't always capture the full picture of public opinion.
Okay, this has been incredibly insightful, a really complex picture painted by these election results.
Indeed. Lots of moving parts.
So here's something to think about as we finish. Given this very decisive mandate the PAP now has, what are the key policy areas you'll be watching? How will they use this mandate to address those concerns around cost of living, jobs, and Singapore's place in the world, while ensuring that stability voters seem to crave?
And what role can the opposition, mainly the WP now, realistically play in shaping those discussions from their current position?
Exactly. Definitely food for thought for the coming years. Thanks for tuning in to the Deep Dive.